Hello and welcome to episode 412 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Licks. Damien, we're back.
We are back, and before we move on, Andy, I want to mention that on Thursday, the 4th of May, so this coming Thursday, I'm going to be doing a live podcast record in King's Cross. So if you're near King's Cross, if you're just in London, come to the live podcast record. I'm doing it with Pension Bee. It's going to be me on the panel talking about pensions versus ISA with Claire Barrett, who is from the FT, and she's fantastic, and also Peter from Conversation of Money. So you can get a free ticket by clicking on the link in the notes of this podcast episode, where it's a free ticket. So you may as well come, and there is alcohol there if you can't be bothered to listen to me talk. But it would be really nice if I went there and I saw as many of you as possible to, I don't know, make me feel good about going and doing this for free. So it's exciting to be back in the studio. We're going back to our normal format. It was great to do the episodes which were the bonus episodes. We had some really good feedback, but this week we are back to our tried and tested 3 pieces talking about money, and I might as well just start because there's a lot of content I'm conscious this week that I'm going to get through. I think I've just got overexcited sometimes and I try and cram too much, but I'm going to tell you what's on the show this week. So inspired by the bonus episodes about hearing other people's view on money, what I'm doing is pulling together some of the best tips or advice from 10 of the best money books that you can get in the UK. So I'm going to rattle through those tips and give you insights and homework, some podcasts to listen to. So there's going to be a lot of content in there. So some things that you can do to improve your finances, things to take away. The next piece on the podcast is going to be about artificial intelligence. So you can't move for people talking about AI, and in particular ChatGPT. So what I'm going to do is do a piece about how to invest to take advantage of the rise of artificial intelligence. It's inspired by an 80/20 investor research piece. And the final piece on the podcast, Andy, is going to be done by you.
That's right. I'm going to be talking about Chase Bank. They've introduced 1% interest on current account balances. And there's a few other bits and pieces I want to update people on, because you need to get in quick if you want to take advantage of certain features on that bank account in the next few weeks. And so let's move on to the first piece straight away then, because there's lots to get on with this week. And you're going to provide some key takeaways from some of the popular money books that are out there.
Yeah, so going back to the first bonus episode that we did with Toby, and she launched a new book, and hearing insights from her. I'm always reading lots of different books, different topics. Of course, I read a lot of money books, and over the years, I take notes on some of the key bits from some of these books. Now, a lot of money books can be repetitive. They take a theme that they just seem to drag on to turn it into a book that you'd actually pay for. But the ones I'm going through in this list are 10 of some of the most popular books in the UK or the US, and drawing some of the key parts or key takeaways from them. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of depth to these books. I'm just picking some of the bullet points. It's very high level, so there will be reason to go and read the books yourself. There's lots to take away. Some of the books I've actually done episodes on this podcast I've focused on, one of them being Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I'll come on to that a little bit later. So do go away and have a look at the books. We'll put links to all of them in the notes of this particular podcast episode, but I've tried to pull out some bits so they're not too repetitive when they're going through and taking the key takeaways from each one. So I'm going to start and rattle through these. So the first book is The Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. Now, if you don't know who Dave Ramsey is, he's a money expert in the US. He has a radio show. He has a money academy where he teaches people how to improve their finances and talks about baby steps. It's basically his version of a way to become financially independent, almost like a course to be able to follow through. Now, if you go back to episode 327 of this podcast, I talked about the steps to achieve financial independence, which was inspired by some of the bits that Dave Ramsey does. I brought it into the UK and gave some insight in how you can reach financial independence, a very popular episode. So I'm going to just pick out a couple of bits from Dave Ramsey's book that I think are particularly relevant, so you can apply any of the tips I'm talking about today to your finances or explore them further. Now, the first one is to build a $1,000 starter emergency fund. So let's talk about the UK. Take £1,000. Now, the interesting idea about his starter emergency fund is that it's there to partly break the habit of using credit. So for most people who are trying to sort out their finances, they may be living on their credit cards or in an overdraft, and they want to or need to repay that high interest credit back. So they're trying to clear their debt. And one of the ways you can do that is to use a starter emergency fund to break that reliance on credit. Now, often the advice is you need to clear your debt first before you start saving money up and putting it aside. One of the things that Dave Ramsey talks about is actually breaking that reliance on credit. So give an example. Let's say you have a burst tire on your car. It might cost you 100 and something quid to replace. Then rather than put that on your credit card and therefore increase your debt again, even further, even if you're trying to repay it, which is very deflating, not meaning to use a pun there if you're trying to clear your debt. But what you do instead is you use this emergency fund to be able to pay for that tire to be replaced. You've not increased your credit card debt. Then you immediately then try to rebuild that back to the £1,000, and then you carry on as normal, keep clearing your debt. Now, what that does is break that link and make you less likely to rely on debt and get you out of that cycle. It's a psychological trick. I think it's very useful for certain people. The next thing he focuses on in the book is paying off debt using the debt snowball method, and that's prioritizing high interest rate debt first. Think about your credit card. So if you've not listened to us talk about the snowball method in the past, it's a very well-known method. It's nothing that's unique to Dave Ramsey. In simple terms, what you do is you list all your credit cards that are outstanding, put the balances, put the interest rate you're paying, list them from the highest interest rate to the lowest interest rate, and then what you do is you work out how much money you can repay each month. You pay the minimum on, let's say you've got 5 credit cards, you pay the minimum monthly amount you're allowed to on the 4 cards with the lowest interest rate, and then you pay more than the minimum as much as you can off the card with the highest interest rate. And then once you've cleared it, then you move all the money that you were paying each month against that credit card balance with the highest interest rate. You move all that money onto the next highest credit card you've got left. And that way it means you're paying more than the minimum on that card, and you keep going. So the money keeps snowballing down, and it's the most efficient way to clear debt. Now, you can do it slightly differently. Some people do it based upon the balance size rather than the interest rate. But if you do it via the interest rate, so you focus on the highest bearing interest rate first, then that is the most efficient way to repay it. The other thing, I think that one of the biggest takeaways that Dave Ramsey talks about in his book, if you do one thing today, focus on trying to ditch car repayments. And he gives some numbers, but if you think about it logically, if you are able to ditch your car repayments, it will save you probably between £200 and £300 a month. And Dave Ramsey works out how much that would actually compound to over time. Now, you can imagine the numbers are significant. If you applied that money to your wealth, so you started to save or invest that money for the long term, then it's one of the easiest ways to become wealthier. So you get off that car finance merry-go-round, because don't forget that what often happens is you pay that money after a few years, normally a balloon payment, but typically people then get another new car, which they stay on that merry-go-round of paying large monthly amounts to the finance companies to have a brand new car. Instead, if you bought a nearly new car or an older car and you owned it outright, then you won't be paying that money each month, which you can put to growing your wealth by investing, for example. It's one of the biggest tips that I would give to people that's relatively simple. Now, if you go to podcast 346, I talk about escaping car finance. Now, that is still very relevant to today. And the reason that I mention it can be quite easy to get out of it is because we're in a period of time where second-hand car values are very high. And it means that you can actually get more for your car. It's worth more than what your final balloon payment may be when you're doing car finance may be. So you could actually get to the end of your 3 years if you're taking out some kind of car finance, and the amount outstanding will be less than the car's value. So in theory, the difference between what the car's worth and what you owe on it means you could buy a second-hand car and not have any car finance. Normally what happens when you get to the end of any financing deal is that it's roughly worth what the outstanding finance is. But at the moment, because the second-hand car market is so buoyant, partly because of the lack of chips for cars, and there are so many people that I know that are moaning about the fact that they've tried to buy a new car and had to wait 6-9 months to actually receive the car. That is another reason why second-hand cars are more expensive and the prices have remained high over the last couple of years. So it is a good time if you want to get off of the car finance merry-go-round that you might be able to. So go listen to that podcast episode. The other thing he mentions is consider downsizing your home. gym to free up cash flow. That's something that's a little bit more drastic, but it is a very viable option. And of course, he talks about increasing your income through a side job. Obviously, something I'm quite keen on. Money to the Masses was ultimately what they would call now a side hustle, although I don't really like that term. And it became a business and my full-time job. And obviously, me and Andy work together with the others in the office on Money to the Masses. So things can happen from something that starts off as a side passion. And of course, asking for pay rises. Now, we have got a podcast we've done on it, but if you go onto the Money to the Masses website and put in pay rise into the search bar, you'll find an article, and you'll also find the podcast episode where we talked about it, some tips and tricks to try and increase your chances of getting a pay rise. Next book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now, podcast episode 355 was called The Difference Between the Poor and the Rich. It was one of the most popular episodes that we've ever done. And I did talk a lot on there about the difference between the rich and the poor, and actually how people on lower income can be taxed at a disproportionate rate because of the way the taxation system works. I'm not going to dwell on it here. It's well worth you going to listen, given the feedback that we've had. But I talk about the book in that particular episode, the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book. Some things I agree with, some things I don't really agree with in the book. But one of the tips that he gives is really focusing on assets that generate income rather than liabilities that drain your finances. So you want to focus on things that will increase the amount of money that you can generate, your wealth. So think of things like good debt versus bad debt. We've covered that on the podcast before. So good debt is things that you will borrow money to be able to do something with it that could potentially increase your wealth. That might be something to do with a business. Bad debt is something where you're taking money to use it on something that is probably going to be a drain. So you're borrowing money on a credit card to go and buy, I don't know, expensive items or clothing or something like that. That is a bad debt. So focus on things that are going to improve your wealth rather than things that are going to drain your finances. So things that you will buy that could suck up even more and more of your money over time. Now, one of the big messages in the book is to take control of your finances and become financially literate. Obviously, you're listening to this podcast, so I'm guessing that you're all trying to do that. The next book is The Richest Man in Babylon. It's one of my favorite money books. Now, podcast episode 319 was titled How to Become Rich, and it focused on this book and some of the lessons from it. So go and listen to that. It's well worth reading the book, actually, because it's a very short book and it's written in a way that's quite entertaining. It's more of a parable about how you become wealthy. So that book has a lot of underlying messages in it, but one of them, very simple: start saving at least 10% of your income for your future. So if you qualify to be auto-enrolled in work, make sure that you are in your scheme. As an employee, you'll pay 5% of your qualifying salary. 3% will be paid by your employer. Why not talk to them to see if they can increase that and match yours to 5%? That's 10% of your wealth being put aside for your retirement. But it's a good starting figure, 10% of your wealth. Are you doing that? Can you get to that figure? But one thing I would say is it shouldn't be surprising, that 10% of your income number, because if you look at things like religious institutions, they often talk about people giving 10% of their earnings to the church, for example. And as we know, the Catholic Church is one of the richest institutions in the world. So that is a bit of knowledge that's obviously been around for hundreds of years. Another tip is live below your means and avoid unnecessary expenses. That is largely common sense, but most people don't apply it. It's a good reminder for you to sit there and think about it this weekend. Am I doing that? Do I know what my means are? Do I look at my budget? One of the things that Dave Ramsey focuses on, and a lot of books do, is about budgeting. Now, I'm not going to dwell on how to budget. Instead, go to moneytothemasses.com/budget-planner, which is a free downloadable Excel spreadsheet that helps you make a budget and also has plenty of links in that spreadsheet to be able to cut your bills and therefore hopefully increase the amount of money you can set aside for your future. Going back to The Richest Man in Babylon, don't invest in anything you don't understand. Interestingly, the FSCS released a piece of research this week that talked about crypto. And so it stated that while 90% of people knew what cryptocurrencies were, only 10% of people stated that they actually understood what it was. I think that's slightly overstated, to be honest. I was surprised that 10% of people they asked really understood how crypto works and investing in it. But make sure you understand what you're investing in. And the final tip I'd pull out of that book is surround yourself with successful people and learn from their experiences. That is kind of what's happening on this part of the podcast. If you haven't got lots of successful people that you know, then read around the subject. Listen to podcasts, watch videos. There's plenty of information out there that you can learn from. The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham's quite an interesting book, a very famous investing book, actually. And if I turn around while I'm doing this podcast, there is a copy of it on the shelf. So if you look at the videos we do on YouTube, if you look in the corner, you will find a copy of it there. Now, one of the main messages, it is a bit more about value investing, is focus on long-term investing and avoid short-term speculation. In a couple of weeks, interestingly, I'm appearing on a podcast for Interactive Investor. I was asked to appear on it. And one of the questions I was asked was regarding my first ever investment. And it was when I was younger, and it was more speculation. And funnily enough, I made 30% in about 3 months, but that was pure luck. And the lessons learned from that, I talk about them in that show. Maybe I'll do an episode for Money to the Masses on that particular topic and the lessons I learned from it, because it was something that was clearly in hindsight very speculative, but I'd learned the positives out of that. So I didn't carry on down that road of speculating. The Millionaire Next Door is the next book. Live frugally and avoid unnecessary spending. That was one of the ones we mentioned earlier. Invest in a diversified portfolio of bonds, stocks, and real estate and other assets. That goes without saying. Focus on long-term wealth building, not getting rich quick. So get rich slowly. And that is often a real theme of what we talk about on Money to the Masses and the whole Grow It series. If you haven't seen our Grow It series, then make sure you go on YouTube, because it was incredibly popular. By the end of it, I didn't realize, but there was 2 hours worth of video split into 10 different videos. So there's a lot of content on there that we gave away for free about how to get started with investing. And the other tip is avoid lifestyle inflation or increasing your spending as your income grows. Now, think about it. Do you do this, or have you done it? And I've seen this called lifestyle creep. So you might get a pay rise and you start spending up to that limit. So we all do this, but I've become very conscious of it as I've grown older to try and not allow it to happen. So if you get a pay rise, think about whether you use that extra money that you didn't have previously and you could do something with it, like invest it for your future. So lifestyle creep, be very aware of it. Your Money or Your Life is another book that's got quite a few lessons in it. Consider downsizing your possessions and embracing a minimalist lifestyle. Now, that is a bit like what Dave Ramsey suggested, but I'm a bit of a fan of it. I'm not the complete minimalist. I don't live like Steve Jobs in a very minimal kind of house, but I buy things that I need rather than buying things that are deemed relatively unnecessary. So that's a personal thing, but if you can head towards that, then you probably don't need as much money as you think. But what I would take that one and take it a step further is work out what your number is. How much money do you actually need at any given moment if the worst was to happen? So work out what your minimalist lifestyle is if it was forced upon you. So I previously called this the lockdown lifestyle. So what was your lockdown lifestyle like? It wasn't all bad. It was forced upon us, but we soon worked out what we valued and how much things cost. We didn't spend hardly any money during that period because we couldn't, but then we still made the best of it. So work out what your lockdown lifestyle is, how much that would cost you. That's the amount of money that you really need to survive. So that can also be useful when you're trying to work out your emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of salary or expenses, or your lockdown lifestyle, whichever way you want to look at it. Another one is calculate your true hourly wage and consider whether purchases are worth the time you have to spend working to afford them. So this is actually a tip that we've done on the podcast previously, and I want to give you a quick trick to work it out. If you don't know what your hourly rate is, most people don't. So typically you'll probably work in the UK somewhere between 35 and 40 hours a week. So based upon that assumption, if you take your annual gross salary and you divide it by 2,000, or to make it simple, knock 3 zeros off it and then divide that number by 2. So if you earn 30,000, then that means your hourly rate is £15 an hour. So when you go to buy something and it costs £45, then you know it's going to take you 3 hours of work to earn that particular item. And as soon as you start thinking like that, it will change your mindset about the value of that particular item. So it's a very easy trick to pivot your mind to think about things you need rather than things you just want, so spending your money on things that are unnecessary. They also advise using cash instead of credit cards to avoid overspending. I mean, there is an extreme version of that where you budget using cash and envelopes, which is very successful, or or you could not necessarily have to just use cash, but you could budget in a way that uses things like Monzo or Starling that have pots. That can be a similar thing. I get the idea of using cash rather than credit cards because there is a danger that once you start spending, you think, oh, well, it doesn't matter if I spend a bit more. We've all probably been there when we were younger. I'll just put it on the credit card that night out. And then once you've done it once, you do it again and again. And that's how your debts rack up. So if you try and stick to spending in cash, not necessarily in physical cash, it can be cash from your current accounts, and you budget for those expenses, then it's likely to help you repay your debt and stop you getting into any more debt. Focus on reducing fixed expenses. That goes without saying. The budget planner I mentioned earlier will help you to do that. Again, focusing on alternative sources of income. They talk about side hustles, but they also talk about things like freelancing. Are there ways you can generate more income aside from your actual job? Develop a clear vision of what you want to achieve with your money and why it's important to you. And one tip I quite liked is practicing gratitude and focusing on the things that really matter in life rather than just accumulating wealth. So as much as we talk about accumulating wealth, there is more to life than that. If I'm moving on to the simple path to wealth, now this book has some good tips which are avoiding picking individual stocks and trying to time the market. It's something that obviously, if you listen to us, I advocate a hell of a lot. In the next section of this podcast, I talk about artificial intelligence, but I'm not talking about investing in individual stocks, more of a diversified fund. So while you can try and play a theme by picking individual stocks, it's better from a risk management point of view to pick something that's far more diversified, such as a fund, to play a particular theme if you're interested in it. Focus on long-term investing and stick to your plan even during market downturns. That's a very important one. One thing that I always focus on is working out the rate of return that I would need to achieve my long-term goal. And that number should be something fairly realistic given the risk level that you are taking. But it means that you don't get carried away when you have massive up years in stock markets or down years. You just focus more on your long-term goal and how you are getting on along that journey. So you don't get carried away emotionally when markets are volatile. And they also mention about being aware of tax implications of your investments and also using tax loss harvesting to minimize your tax liability. Now, podcast 407, I talked about planning for the CG allowance cut. I touch upon all of those topics in there. It's not something to be obsessed with, tax loss harvesting, but it's more about being aware about how your investments are taxed. We also touched upon that on the Grow It campaign, which you would have received via the podcast feed as well. And the last couple of books I'm going to quickly run through. The Bogglehead's Guide to Investing. Again, it's very much sensible advice about avoiding impulsive decisions. Consider using pound cost averaging to smooth out fluctuations in your investment returns. So that is where you put in money each month. So you have a lump sum rather than put it all in at once. You put it in maybe over 6 months, 12 months in equal installments. And therefore, if the market falls, what it really means is your money is buying more of the stuff you were trying to invest in, whether it's shares or fund units. And so when the market hopefully rebounds over the long term, then you will actually be better off because the units you bought probably at the bottom of the market will have rallied even more than the ones that you bought when the market was a bit higher. If, on the other hand, you put all your money in straight away and the market then collapsed, it's going to have to get back to where it was when you invested all of that money just to break even. Whereas with pound cost averaging, obviously, you would be better off if the market falls. Okay, there is that converse argument that if the market goes straight up, then you would have been better off putting your money in straight away rather than dripping it in over time. But that is the benefit of hindsight, and markets don't tend to go straight up for very long. The Boggleheads also give the sensible advice of being diversified across a range of asset classes, geographic regions, and they also say about reducing risk to maximize returns, all very sensible stuff. And The Psychology of Money, which is one of my favorite books, I have to say, in the money space, where each chapter is something that is very tangible. Sometimes books do meander and sometimes they do just keep drumming the same message all the way through the book. These are all very distinct and different lessons that you can learn. So if there's one book I would recommend you read, it's this one. Be aware of your own biases and emotional reactions to financial decisions is a key takeaway. If you want to hear more about that sort of thing, then go to podcast 185, where we did a piece on how to avoid behavioral biases and the impact they can have on investment returns. That's from almost 5 years ago. It just shows you how evergreen the content we create is then the final tip, which one I do think is important, is make a plan and stick to it, but be flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. So one thing is that it's okay setting a plan, but you've got to realise you can't be too wedded to it, whether it's about repaying your mortgage, whether it's about becoming financially independent. Life has a habit of throwing us curveballs. You've got to be flexible. When I'm looking at my finances, probably the biggest priority I always give myself is flexibility. So whether it's deciding how long to fix my mortgage for, whether it's deciding how to invest money, whether to put money in an ISA or pension, all of these things, baked at the heart of it is flexibility, so I can roll with the punches. And I think a lot of people sometimes become wedded on the perfect solution rather than the one that might give them the most flexibility for their circumstances. We're all different. And the final book I'm going to mention is one that doesn't get a lot of press release, The Blueprint to Financial Independence. It does what the book cover pretty much says, but they do talk about the gap, which is the difference between your income and your expenses, and trying to increase that by reducing your expenses, but also trying to increase your income. So it's a theme that you've heard from some of the other books, but it's looking at the two levers and actually realizing if you increase that gap, then you can increase your savings rate, which is how much money that you put away. And the other tip that they say is obviously continuously educate yourself on personal finance. That goes without saying, and particularly investing topics, so you can make informed decisions and take advantage of new opportunities as they arise. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I said we'll put links in the notes of this podcast. But what I wanted to do is give people food for thought and give them some places where they could go to learn a little bit more about some of these topics. Because I do realise, although we had a fantastic review recently where somebody went and listened to every episode of our podcast in an incredibly short space of time, which must have meant they were listening to us for about 4 or 5 hours a day, which I am very impressed with. I do realise some people might want to jump into different topics and try and learn a little bit more. So hopefully I've given them a means to do that.
Okay, so moving on to the next piece of the podcast then, artificial intelligence. It's everywhere. And Damien, you've done a little bit of research for 80/20 investor members on how you can invest with the theme of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so artificial intelligence, like Andy said, is everywhere. So ChatGPT is the artificial intelligence, so AI chatbot that was developed by a company called OpenAI. And it was launched in November to the world, November 22, that is. And it has taken the world by storm. I mean, there's been predictions of it disrupting entire industries, from journalism through to the arts. There is talk of it disrupting industries in healthcare. It has also been likened to the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the printing press, the invention of the computer and the birth of the internet, as an innovation that could change the way that society operates, how we engage with technology, about productivity levels changing. And so there's a lot of press that's both positive and negative about the concept of artificial intelligence. But I think the one thing that people can agree on is that the genie is out of the bottle now, and we are going to have to accept that this is going to change and disrupt a lot of industries. Now, of course, there's a lot of negatives to that, because it could mean there's going to be job losses, because at the moment you can get the artificial intelligence services out there to do things like pass law exams. They can write dissertations, they can write entire articles, they can code new websites. There's even somebody online who I saw that was using ChatGPT to launch a business, starting with $100 and then coming up with ideas of businesses, then trying to come up with ideas how to market that business and launch it. And by all accounts, it's doing relatively well. So there are people who are saying the limits are almost endless for what AI can do. But of course, AI is changing at a pace. Anything we talk about now is likely to be out of date, not in just weeks, but in days almost. And so we have to be realistic about what it can and can't do at the moment, and that's going to change. We've played around with it, haven't we, Andy? You even asked ChatGPT about a month or two ago whether I was a legend. I don't know quite why you did it, but it came up with you.
Can I be honest? I asked it about me first, and when it came up with no results, I thought you've got a bit more clout. So
yeah, and I think with a bit of persuasion from Andy, it did come up with the fact that it stated that I was a legend, which I thought was quite nice. But also, they are prone to hallucinations, which is where they give you false information, because it did also state that I wrote a particular book. It gave the title of the book, which did include the Money to the Masses in the title. And it sounded a great money book. But not only have I not written that book, nobody on the planet has written a book with any title like it. So it completely made it up. So there are limitations to AI, but we can't deny that it has the potential to transform industries. And as a result, there are a lot of companies out there that are absolutely bricking it when it comes to AI, because it can do at scale what it could take hundreds of people to produce, whether it's from writing, coding. It can do so much so quickly that companies like Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, are worried, because in theory, if we are all asking chatbots about where we're going to go for dinner and it come up with everything you want, or go on holiday, it could make search redundant. So we could be sitting there talking to things like Alexa, as it should have been, where you could ask them anything and actually give you a proper serious answer that is useful, rather than being a glorified egg timer. So on that theme, I've had lots of people ask me, how can I invest in AI? How could I expose my portfolio to that theme? And artificial intelligence is the theme at the moment. So don't be surprised if you're going to see a wave of funds, particularly ETFs, that will be launched saying they're going to be AI focused. Now, the danger is you won't necessarily know all the companies they invest in. They might be investing in some quite small companies, which are obviously high risk. But you just got to look at all the startups out there, tech startups. It seems that any tech startup has got some kind of AI focus. So there's a lot of people out there who are trying to absorb a lot of money to launch some new businesses. So you've got to be careful. So somebody asked me, how could you invest in AI? So I look at it from a more diversified point of view, because you can't invest in a fund just because it's got AI in the name, because you should dig beneath the bonnet to see what that is and what it's investing in. Because what happens, I guarantee you, marketing companies come up with marketing ideas and they use that, and fund houses will launch funds because it's a way to attract money. They make their money by getting people to invest in something, and they charge a percentage fee on that, obviously, for their annual management fee. But they need to attract money, and one way to do that is to ride the current theme. Why do you think there are lots of ethical based funds out there? So the way I tackled this was to go and look at a bunch of companies, or try and find a bunch of companies that are focused on AI. And interestingly, you can find a lot of big tech name companies out there that are putting a lot of money into AI. Now, OpenAI has been in partnership with Microsoft. So Microsoft have been investing heavily in AI research for some time. And it's got its Azure AI platform as well, which is one of the most advanced AI systems out there. And Microsoft has announced a further multi-billion-dollar investment in the partnership with OpenAI. And Microsoft has even embedded some of the OpenAI ChatGPT technology into its search engine, Bing. So if you go and look, you can register and you can actually get AI to help you with search. And don't forget that because Microsoft has that as your AI platform, AI requires a huge amount of processing power. And so these cloud platforms are going to be in demand. So Microsoft is a good example of a company that is investing heavily in AI, and it's arguably ahead of a lot of its competitors. So by going around and looking at companies that are now being either exposed to AI because they're developing things like chatbots, but there are plenty of companies that are integral in the delivery of AI, whether that's through cloud platforms or chips that will be needed for the processing of AI, or companies that are using it to embed it in the processes of their company. Because one of the things about AI as it becomes even more advanced is it will enable companies to use artificial intelligence to make them far more productive. And that could be in terms of delivering the right outcomes for their customers. So Microsoft is obviously a good example of a company that could be argued is a play on the AI theme, even though it's a very big diversified business. So the other 7 companies I'm going to mention of that ilk, they're large companies that you can find within investment funds. So these aren't recommendations that you go buy shares in these companies. It's just information purposes that are companies out there that have a exposure of some kind to the AI theme. One of them is Nvidia, which is a leading provider of GPUs, which are graphic processing units, and they are using a wide range of applications, including AI, which why they are interesting. So they are a company that you could be argued that are well positioned to benefit from the rise of AI. Now, I mentioned Alphabet earlier. That's Google's parent company. They have been clearly running around in a panic because of what's happened with ChatGPT, and they're racing to catch up. I mean, they've always been investing in some kind of AI already, but they've now apparently combined their AI research units, Brain and DeepMind, to accelerate their AI progress. And I mean, their AI technology is already being used in a wide range of applications, which include things like self-driving cars, healthcare, and education, but they are clearly accelerating that. Salesforce is another one, so slightly different take on the AI theme. They've invested heavily in AI-powered solutions for customer relationship management, so CRM. And their Einstein AI platform is one of the most advanced in the CRM space, and it's capable of analyzing vast amounts of customer data and providing personalized insights. Alibaba is another company that might be of interest, so we're looking over now towards China. They've announced the release of their own chat bot in the future, so they are going to be investing heavily in AI. I won't go into too many details. Another company along the same theme is Baidu, if that's how you pronounce it. Their technology is used in a variety of applications, including speech recognition, natural language processing, and again, autonomous vehicles. Tencent, if you think of Google in China's equivalent, that is Tencent. They apparently are developing their own ChatGPT equivalent. Now, it's even been rumored to already have a name. I can't pronounce the name. I'm not going to try, but they are another company. Amazon. So Amazon has been investing in AI-powered solutions. Again, normally in things like natural language processing and robotics. And again, it's used in a variety of applications, but they are also a leading player in cloud computing, so cloud software, which also makes them very interesting. So it's a slightly different play again. And there are other companies out there you could also look at, companies such as IBM. So there are a host of companies, but what I did for 80/20, I took the 8 that I mentioned and went and analysed all the unit trusts out there to see which ones had significant exposure to those companies and looked at the totality of that exposure to see which were most exposed to these companies and therefore have some exposure to the AI theme potentially. And what's interesting, I'm not going to give away the funds. You can go and look at the research yourself if you want to by registering for a free trial of 80/20 Investor. But what is interesting is that they're not just technology company funds that you're going to find. The top 2 are, but there are Chinese equity funds, because obviously I mentioned a number of Chinese companies there. One thing that's interesting about the China space is that already the authorities out there have made noises about clamping down on the development of AI, or certainly looking at the development of it, which did impact some of the share prices because that could be a headwind. But then if you look at Europe, Italy have already started to interfere with the progress of ChatGPT in Italy for privacy reasons. So they fear about the privacy of what people are putting in to the chatbot. So I think that AI is not going to be a very simple one-way bet. I think there's going to be a lot of nuances that come in with it. There's going to probably be some headwinds, especially from regulation. If you think about it from the money and health space, they are areas that if people get an answer, and we've already proved that the thing can hallucinate, then that could be potentially dangerous and open to all sorts of lawsuits. And of course, don't forget that regulation in terms of privacy, GDPR, and also regulation of financial advice, that is something that I think is all going to be thrown into the mix. I don't think it's going to be plain sailing for AI, but it is still interesting as a theme nonetheless. But the message from this part of the podcast is that you can start to try and get exposure to this theme potentially, because all of the American firms that I've mentioned released their earnings results this week, and it was littered with references to AI and the future of AI and how they're going to harness AI. So it's very much on their radar. And so you can gain some exposure to the theme, and your portfolio probably already does have some exposure potentially to these themes, given that some of these companies make up the largest portion of the American stock market, the S&P 500, which is a cap-weighted index.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. I'm going to quickly bring to the podcast Chase Bank. Now, we talked about Chase a few weeks ago. There's been further developments at Chase, and this week they've announced that they will be paying 1% interest on all current account balances for new and existing customers, which is pretty good when you compare it to other interest-paying current accounts out there. Now, Chase currently pays 3.1% already on its Saver account, which is pretty decent, and also 5% interest on its Roundup account. Roundups quite simply is if you spend your money, let's say you spend £2.50 on a coffee, it would then move the 50p and round it up to the nearest pound into a separate account. Now, Chase has an account where that money that's moved across will actually earn 5% interest. So the announcement this week where they'll pay 1% interest on current accounts means it doesn't matter whether you spend money because you're going to earn cash back, whether you save money because you're going to earn money through its saver account or Roundups. Now, just for leaving your money in the Chase account, you will actually earn a small amount of interest as well. So that's pretty interesting. The reason I wanted to bring it on the pod, particularly this week, is that if all of that sounds interesting and you're interested in taking out a Chase account, there are going to be some monthly caps placed on the cashback that you can earn. And the significant date you need to keep an eye on is the 9th of May. So if you're interested in Chase and you're interested in that cashback for the first 12 months without having any monthly caps on it, you need to apply before the 9th of May. Another reason why you might want to consider Chase is they're particularly competitive if you're using the card abroad. They don't charge any fees for using it abroad. So if you're quick and you get in there and you use your Chase card abroad, you can actually even earn cash back while you're spending money on your summer holiday this year.
So as Andy said, the reason we mentioned it on the podcast, because there are a number of you that are very keen on accounts or cards to take on holiday, also cashback. And it just so happens that there's a small window where you can take out a Chase account and still benefit from the original terms. We don't have a cap. So it's just something that's quite interesting. I know a lot of you seem to be quite fans of Chase at the moment. I mean, at times we've done things in the past and haven't mentioned Chase. We always seem to get an email message from someone saying, what about Chase? I don't know if they work for them or not. I think they actually are genuine listeners, but it is an interesting offer nonetheless. And just to point out, Andy has done an article on this on the Made to Messages website, which compares it to other accounts as well. So there's a full article which we will link to in the notes of this episode.
And so that is it. We're done for this week. If you can possibly do us a favor and please do review the podcast wherever you get your podcast. 5-star reviews really help us to rise up the charts and help to reach more people.
So obviously don't forget to come and meet me on Thursday, the 4th of May for that live podcast record. Make sure you click on the link in the notes to get a free ticket and come and say hello. I'd love to see as many of you as I can. It'll be, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, it should be a great event. And if nothing else, there's booze there if you're that way inclined.
So that's it. We're done for this week. Until next time.
Until next time.